So how many of you are actually scouting deer habitat for bucks right now, or soon, or you want to create those conditions for bucks? Scouting deer habitat for bucks. Maybe a little bit of a catchy title, but depth of cover is not a catchy title. Depth of cover is something I've talked about a lot. It's something I believe in and written about many times. It's a phrase I coined many years ago to explain the layering effect of does and bucks and where bucks will be. And you can apply this to anywhere that whitetails roam. It's always a way that you can find bucks. This buck right here, one of our favorites throughout the year, and this is one Diane shot last year. Pretty cool buck, isn't it? Called him the split brow buck for obvious reasons. You can see those right there. Diane now thinks, because she shot this, that any split brow buck, including the new one we have in Minnesota coming up, is hers to go after. But bottom line is, these bucks, this was a 6-year-old right here. We had many years of pictures of him. He was around because we had enough depth of cover. And you could find this buck in our area in his hangout if you just followed these rules I'm going to go over for scouting bucks, big buck habitat. And it'll get into bucks, you know, the older ones in the neighborhood. I'm not saying that every place has a 6-year-old buck. I'm hoping we have a few 6-year-old bucks on the property in Minnesota. Not likely, but at least a 4 or 5-year-old maybe. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to find these. And hopefully we'll be able to find another split brow buck for Diane to shoot. Someone asked me the other day, what happened to the split brow buck? Well, they missed the video we shot of Diane shooting this buck, and so excited for her. People asked me, well, you were after that buck too for a couple of years. Wouldn't you have rather shot him? And I said, no way. The excitement that Diane had for shooting this buck, and she had it on her screensaver on her phone for months afterwards. So pretty cool. But there's some conditions when you're scouting that you have to find to even find mature bucks. So many times people are going out into the woods and they're scouting, and they're not actually being very efficient because they're looking for buck sign when they haven't actually ruled where bucks are going to live in the first place, using the principle and concept of depth of cover. If you use that with depth of cover, whether you're scouting public land or you're actually building something on private land, then you're going to succeed. You're going to find whitetails, and you're going to get into that older age class of bucks, whatever that age is in the area. It's all relative. Depth of cover, like I said, kind of a boring thing, but it's so true, and it's very definitive. Depth of cover is simple. You have to have food, so you have to have a good food source. That might be a greenbrier top in southern Ohio. It might be a huge stand of white oaks on an island out in a bunch of marshes in Minnesota. It might be a red osier dogwood thicket with a bunch of gnarly tag alder in an otherwise sandy and pine conifer infested area in central Michigan. It might be that big hardwoods in Pennsylvania, and you have a south facing slope with giant tops where a windstorm went through. It's allowed a lot of early successional growth, and it's the one area that's like that out of hundreds if not thousands of acres of area. And if you add in a hemlock bench down below, then you have the conditions to find good quality habitat, a good food source, and a base of deer. So you have to find that base of deer anyways, anywhere, and that's going to always revolve back to food. Obviously there's cover, or you wouldn't be hunting there in the first place. It's like, what came first, chicken or the egg? Well, we're assuming there's a chicken, because without a chicken, they're not going to lay eggs. Could go back and forth on that, but bottom line is you have to have food. You're obviously hunting there because there's cover in the first place. So you have to have food. Once you find the main food source in the area, and that could be changing on public land. It could be white oaks early, it could be red oaks later, it could be a new clear-cut thicket that they're really hitting towards fall and December. And deer are a little bit more migratory and almost moving like caribou out on public land in big areas. But you have to find that food. Then you find, and there's got to be cover adjacent to that food. It can't be a white oak stand that's 15 acres and it's open adjacent to big open timber, because then you might put those does a quarter mile away, 600 yards away, and does a mature buck or a buck in general relate to that food source every day if he has to travel so far to get it because he's displaced, because he doesn't have that cover? So you find food, you find cover, you find those does within that cover, you still have cover around them, and then you find bucks. That's that depth I'm talking about. On public land, that depth might extend 3/4 of a mile to a mile from that food source. Big baiting areas in the UP of Michigan. A lot of locations within that bait, and within those baiting areas, they get hit by mature bucks in the middle of the night, but that mature buck might be bedded 3/4 of a mile to a mile away from that area because he has the space to do so, because he has public land and he has room to roam. Those does are typically 200 yards away from that food source. They can hear you coming in, leaving. They pattern you, especially in those baiting areas, especially where people are accessing with ATVs. They pattern you a lot easier than you can pattern them. But no, there's going to be food. If you have cover, does, cover, you'll eventually have bucks. Now on the back side of that, if that gets you back to an ag field 200 yards away, you're pinching out the room enough for bucks to bed there, unless it might be an extreme condition where there's not a lot of cover, say northern Ohio, where you might have a 10 or 20 acre cover, patch of cover, and a section of land, 640 acres, might be all the cover that's there. So deer are really sandwiched in close proximity to each other, but that's not natural. That's not the way they want. And that's why when you get up into the UP of Michigan, northern Minnesota, big wilderness areas, big hardwoods of Pennsylvania, where I walk in an hour and a half to hunt, southern Ohio, big hardwoods of Kentucky, even out in the more plain states where deer are really scattered throughout large open areas or large thickets, you find that deer take that space, and those bucks are a lot further away from that food source, and certainly those does, than they would be if they're compacted into a northern Ohio coverless ag region. So there's a balance there. You have to understand that balance. That's why I hate numbers. You know, you have to have 10% in food plots, or you have to have 1% or 5%, or bucks are always 150 yards back or 250 yards back or a mile back. That's just not the case. There's a balance to everything. If you get back to where those bucks should be and you have open ag land, or if you have hunting pressure or road or something, they might not be there. You're running out of depth. Your depth is more in the middle in that case. No different than if you have big ag land on the top of a ridge and you have big ag land at the bottom of the ridge and there's only 200 yards in between. It's likely you don't have enough room, except in the most coverless ag regions, where if you have that kind of hills, those kind of hills, you probably have a lot more cover. And 200 yards is not enough to stick a buck in the middle and have does by both those food sources. That's why there's no rhyme or reason either. Again, going back to, I can't stand that, you know, someone will say, well, bucks always bed high or bucks always bed low. Well, if there's food low, they're going to bed high. If there's food high, they're going to bed low. It's pretty easy. If there's food high, food low, and there's not enough depth in between, they're going to bed to the sides if they can find cover. If there's enough depth, if there's enough room. Depth of cover means food, does, bucks. There's a balance on that distance between coverless ag and big open woods, not necessarily north or south thing. And if you put a lot more deer into the equation, population gets higher, then you can easily squeeze out those bucks in areas that don't have a lot of cover, because they can't find that depth where they can get away, not only from you as a hunter, but from does, and that's the next part of the equation. This applies to public or private land. You have to have consistent cover all the way through, or you're not going to experience this depth of cover and this layering of deer. You have to have limited hunting pressure. If you pressure this doe area, which a lot of times is a staging area. Staging area is the last form of effective cover before bucks or does step out into their afternoon food source. And if you hunt there, stick your stand there, blow your scent into that area like a lot of people do because it's full of rubs and scrapes and a lot of deer sign, then you're destroying that doe bedding area, and you're pushing those does back here, and you eliminate the depth of cover for bucks and the depth of cover you need, regardless of whether it's on public land, because you're pushing those bucks way outside of their naturally daily movement. You know, in an area where bucks will traditionally move 200 to 400 yards, like a mixed ag region, from their bedding area to a food source every afternoon, if you push those does back to 300 to 400 yards, you're not going to have bucks that relate to that, because they want to go relate to another food source somewhere else that's less hunter pressured. So whether you pressure the food, the does, it makes sense, you can almost pressure the buck area more than the does and food, because if you could keep the consistency of the does hitting that food source unpressured every single day, bucks will eventually follow and fall into a line. And I find a lot of times, even when we shoot them, that another buck just takes its place. But you have to have bucks, or food, does, and then bucks. And you have to have limited hunting pressure, because if you apply too much hunting pressure at the food, you push those does back to where bucks will bed, now you don't have enough room for bucks. It doesn't matter where you're at. You look at those big public land areas, you're looking more like a half-mile to 3/4 mile range on average, where a buck might be hitting a clear cut, and then he's bedding around the corner a half-mile, 3/4 mile away, maybe across the draw and up on a point. And that's where he's making that daily movement to his food source, hitting that clear cut every single day. But you have to have that depth, and you can't destroy one of those steps in between, or he's gone. There's not enough depth to cover. Cover. That doesn't mean it has to be this beautiful hinge cut area. It doesn't mean it has to be beautiful switchgrass mixed with upland and lots of shrub tips and briars and the perfection that you can put on your property. It's cool about private land. You can make that happen. you can actually install the steps to where you have food, a switchgrass layer, a hinge cut layer, or a hardwood regeneration layer. And then you go back into areas where you have pockets cut, where you have clear cut pockets, and you have early successional growth and briars, and you have all those pieces in place to provide all those layers of perfection. Just has to be adequate. And especially when you get to public land, you're never going to find perfection. You're just finding enough pieces. So you're finding adequate cover, adequate bedding areas. That's why the buck beds, making buck beds is just such a joke, because you're not going to apply perfection to a quote buck bed and have a buck bed there unless you have all these layers happening first. I had someone in a seminar a long time ago, I think it was 2010. They literally threatened me with a lawsuit if I talked about the secrets of buck bedding. In the seminar I was going to give at a QDMA event, they actually threatened the QDMA and the host that was the president of the QDMA chapter. They threatened if I talked about this stuff. I said, I'm not going to talk about this stuff because I don't even believe in it. You have to have these. I talked about these layers in 2010. If you don't have food, you don't have does, then you don't have bucks. The bedding areas just have to be adequate. There's no perfect bedding area. The perfect bedding area for a buck is if you have food, cover, does, cover, then you'll have bucks. And the cover doesn't have to be that great. They're going to be there. So we taped the seminar, we avoided the lawsuit, and that was 10 years ago. So a long time ago. Again, adequate, not perfect. Just has to be there. What this does for you, when you find this amount of cover on public or private land, let's say this is a big block of timber, and you can see right here, when you get behind bucks, you have to have a lot of cover. Little cover, a lot of cover before you hit hunting pressure right here. Or before you hit food or does, whatever it might be. You could have hunting pressure right here, as long as it doesn't infringe on these areas in here. This. If this is clear. So let's say that's a big area that you hunt. There's enough cover and width here, enough length, and you're holding food, does, and bucks in that area. With that right there, it provides a defined stand and time use. We have another video talking about morning and evening defined stands, so that's one of the greatest tests of a good property. If you can't tell me what a morning stand is versus an evening stand, we have work to do. And I hope the videos help. But food sources, that's more evening hunting. You can't get into those areas in the morning because you spook out deer. You have to be very mindful if you get in there in the evening. It might be easy to get in because the deer are back here in the bedding areas, but you have to be able to get out without spooking them. That's another part of the equation you have to follow. This area back here, morning area, strong morning area. Areas where you can get to in the morning because deer are here, you're traveling around this way to get into a stand position with winds going this way. You might be traveling around this way to get into a stand position with winds going this way. But bottom line is you're waiting for deer to come from here and head back to their bedding areas. Because you have the depth of cover with food, does, and bucks, then you have that layering system where you can get into those locations. That's where I shoot 80% of my bucks, right there. It's a no-brainer. Because most areas don't have depth, most areas don't have food, most areas don't have unpressured food and unpressured cover. So if you have 30 acres that does in the middle of a bunch of areas where people are using ATVs and hunting haphazardly, you're going to have that. And when you have that, easy to hunt because you come in through a back door, right wind, wait for them to come over to you. And if you have too much food to get around, eliminate the food or shrink the food so you can get around it, not spook deer in the morning. So defined evening stands, defined morning stands, that's what the depth of cover for bucks and getting into that deer habitat that holds bucks allows you to do. And then you have this area right here. Off to the side over here. It's that middle layer. It's 100 yards back from a food plot, not 10 yards back, not 200 yards back or 300 yards back. It's in that wheelhouse where you could have deer coming past it in the morning, going through there in the evening to get to food, but definitely daytime cruising. That's why I love to have water holes. Water holes in this area around off to the side of where does bed, in that middle portion of the movement, good mock scrape area, good bow hunting areas. Those are those few stands, let's say you have 12 stands on 40 acres, it might be 2-3 stands where you can hunt all day. Because you can expect a high value in the morning, a high value in the evening, and you hit that high value during the middle of the day. Most stands should be either evening evening for food or morning for bucks in that area, back by their bedding areas. So I hope that makes sense. When you're scouting deer habitat this year for bucks, you have to have these conditions. And if you have those conditions, and you can see that you have an obvious food source on public land where there might be a clear cut, you can use the aerial photos, pictures. We use HuntWise. There's a good lighter color contrast for that. Then you have those areas where you can see obvious beddings, maybe out in the marsh. And then you have islands past that where you can say, okay, this makes sense. Deer are feeding here on this clear cut, this stand of white oak, whatever it might be. And you just look and you know, this is that next cover layer for does. And then there's a cover layer after that. And best of all, it's not by a hunter access road or route. You can tell there's no hunting pressure back there. There's a lot of depth on public land. It might not even be that it's an hour walk back in the woods. It could be 20, but you have a good access route to get in from the side. You walk in 45 minutes, even though it's 20 minutes straight from the food source, and you find really good hunting, and you can build this on private land. You have to have the pieces: food, does, then bucks. Don't have to worry about the perfect buck bed. Don't have to worry about the secrets of buck bedding, learning anything special other than if you have unpressured food next to unpressured doe bedding area, and you have enough room left over for bucks, you'll have mature bucks there as long as you meet their depth requirements. And once you put all that together, now you have a stand assemblage where you have great morning stands, great evening stands, and potentially even some all-day stands in between, so that you can not only find bucks, but then hunt them and have a high value, experience a high value of potential success all day long.